The sun came up hard and flat over Port Stanley, throwing a white band across the water and turning the coal dust on the piers into glitter. On the hills beyond, the grass lay pressed by wind, and inside the harbor, men on British cruisers coughed through the grit of an all-night coaling. Black sacks rose and fell in slings. In the engine rooms, stokers drove shovels like oars. The two battle cruisers that had slipped in days earlier, HMS Invincible flying Vice Admiral Doveton Sturdy's flag, and HMS Inflexible, were still raising steam, their long hulls and tripod masts a new shape in this far corner of the South Atlantic. At the mud berth, the old pre-dreadnought Canopus sat in a dredged channel, like a watchman dozing with one eye open, her guns run out toward the harbor mouth. On the morning of December 8, 1914, a column of smoke appeared on the horizon, where no friendly schedule showed a ship. Lookouts on Sapper Hill ticked off the bearing. On the German cruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, Admiral Graf Maximilian von Spee steered in with a tidy wake, planning to shell the wireless station and coal as raiders did when a war ran long and the world's edges were their roads. The German light cruisers Nuremberg, Leipzig, and Dresden followed with colliers in support. Von Spee had beaten a British squadron at Coronel 5 weeks earlier, sending good men and cold steel to the bottom in the Pacific. That fight had drawn the Empire's attention like a hand to a burn. Port Stanley, usually sleepy, now hid teeth. Shortly after 8, Canopus spoke. From behind an earthen bank, her forward 12-inch guns fired blind overland, the range found by telephone from a spotting station. The noise slapped the town's corrugated roofs. Shells fell short but close enough to throw pillars of water near Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. And that was the point. The German line checked. Von Spee could see masts in the harbor now, more and taller than the old cruisers the British had left scattered around the world in peacetime. The shape of Invincible's upper works showed through the haze. The raid turned into a choice. He turned away to seaward, ordering a general withdrawal. Inside the harbor, the signalmen moved like paired hands. Sturdy's orders ran out across the fleet. Steam rose higher from the funnels. Ashes blew across decks. Lines were cast off with wet slaps. The armored cruisers Kent, Cornwall, and Carnarvon cleared the anchorage with Glasgow and Bristol skirting their flanks. Invincible and Inflexible came last, their turbines building to a long, even thrum. Fresh coal still lay in drifts on their decks. Men wiped black from their eyes and loaded shell. By late morning, the chase had a shape. The British squadron, faster in the big ships and just fast enough in the older cruisers, drove southeast in pale sun. Wind favored the pursuers. Ahead, von Spee split his formation. The light cruisers edged away in the hope of outrunning part of the net, while Scharnhorst and Gneisenau stayed between them and the British line. On Invincible, the rangefinders came down like shutters and went up again, measuring a horizon that heaved and slid. At 12:55 p.m., with the distance still long, the battle cruisers opened fire. The first British salvos threw white water near Scharnhorst, towering higher than her boat cranes. The German flagship answered with disciplined bursts from her 8.2-inch guns, the fall of shot, tight, and quick. Sturdy held his course to keep the sun on his own side, keeping the wind out of his funnels and smoke off the sights. The speed numbers mattered. 25 knots for the British battle cruisers on a clean run, 22 on a good day for the German armored cruisers. The miles shrank the way money does in a market panic. Every minute laid the heavier guns closer to work. It became the kind of duel that occupies a map with the straight lines of intent and the deck with bagged bodies. Invincible and Inflexible concentrated on Scharnhorst first. Shells came on an arc you could not look at without a reflex to duck, and when they found plate, they made a sound that cut through wind and steel, then the duller shock of something inside breaking. One struck Scharnhorst's forward turret, and lit the inside like a furnace. Her list grew. She kept firing. On Gneisenau, Captain Marker watched the flagships roll deepen and called for more speed they could not make. The sea stayed deceptively tidy, a low chop that felt made for running until a shell hit and threw it back in your face in steam. By mid-afternoon, the British armored cruisers found their own matches. Kent, burning stores to keep up, chased Nürnberg to the southeast, her engine room crew stripped to the waist in heat that would have been normal in a boiler house at home, but felt like the tropics here. Cornwall and Glasgow bent after Leipzig, their guns beginning to find the rhythm of the roll. Far back, Bristol and the auxiliary cruiser Macedonia dealt with the frightened colliers, smoke drifting over empty blue. At 4 p.m., Scharnhorst's list was hard to ignore. Her secondary battery fell silent one mount at a time as wiring and crews failed. Fire marched inside her. The flag at her mizzen still streamed. On Invincible's bridge, the rangefinder readings and corrections came as steady as a heartbeat. At 4:17, Scharnhorst heeled over at last and went. There was no time for boats in that sea under that fire. Admirals usually fall in offices or on lists. Von Spee disappeared in foam with his ship, the man who had taken his squadron around half the world to keep a promise to a navy that could not reach him. His son Heinrich, serving in Gneisenau, would follow him into the water later. His other son Otto, on Nürnberg, would not live to see night. Gneisenau fought on alone. Holes stitched her sides. Her bow rose and fell like a tired chest. Sturdy closed carefully, trading time for certainty, refusing the impulse to rush and throw away men to a last broadside. At dusk, Gneisenau's fire slackened. She stopped to starboard, steam feathering from a torn seam, and fired a final ragged volley as if to salute the end of it. She rolled slowly under, lifebelts and cork fanning from her decks. British boats went down and pulled men from oil and cold. Hands grabbed at anything that floated. The figures hauled aboard were gray with salt and smoke, their eyes red-rimmed, the question of what they had seen larger than any ship. The southern part of the fight ran on into the dark. Kent, older and slower on paper, had burned furniture to keep Nürnberg in sight. When she finally overhauled the German light cruiser, the exchange was short and cruel. Nürnberg's silhouette lost pieces until she was a shadow of masts and open fire. She turned on her beam and went under. Kent's boats did what they could. To the west, Leipzig fought Cornwall and Glasgow into night, gun flashes throwing their own weather, until she too ceased fire and rolled. Flares showed faces that might have been anyone's. Dresden alone slipped away in the gathering dark, bound instinctively for the long spaces of the South Pacific and a few months' reprieve before a final trap among the islands. By the time the guns fell quiet, the wind had strengthened, and the sea looked like itself again, indifferent, greedy for wreckage. The British ships had taken hits and splinters, a few dead and wounded, smoke scars on paint, but nothing that threatened the walk home. On bridges and in engine rooms, men felt the exhaustion of a week's fear run off like water from a deck after a wave. In the boats bringing survivors aboard, questions began, names, ships, where the others were, asked in the flat voices of people who had spent the day holding a shape they could only relax out of slowly. On some of the German dead, papers were still dry inside oilskins. In pockets, small objects, photographs, a length of cord, a pencil, settled as the sea pressed the last air out of them. Back in Port Stanley the next day, women and boys who had watched the first guns through field glasses carried kettles down to piers that smelled of hot steel and salt. Wireless at the station tapped news eastward faster than any ship could carry it. London, so far away on every map until something like this happens, would read in hours what had cost a day to do. For those on the raiding stations around the world, coaling captains with flags that bought them neutrality one week and a search the next. The message was clear enough. The ocean had stopped being a loose net. British ships with speed had been sent to tie off the gaps. In the Admiralty lists, the sums looked neat. Losses: Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Nuremberg, Leipzig, Dresden escaped. British: no principal ships lost, damage varied, casualties comparatively light. Behind those lines lay the specific labor that makes a result: coaling through a night when a man cannot keep his teeth clean of grit, dragging a pre-dreadnought into a makeshift berth, and wiring a spotter on a hill to her telephone, holding speed in older engines by feeding them wood when coal and oil do not move the needle, and the dry discipline of keeping a range and a line when the man you are shooting at is shooting back with skill. For Germany, the news closed the book on a squadron that had been a problem since the first telegram of war. For Britain, it paid back coronal in a currency the public understood and the fleet preferred not to spend often. In mess decks that night, men wrote letters with hands that shook less than they had in the morning, and on bridges, the watch kept an eye on the barometer and the lamps, because even victories can be lost at sea if the weather or the chart is not watched carefully. The Falklands sat as they had before, windy, treeless, pragmatic. Grass lay down in gusts. A few pieces of wreckage washed in on the far shore and made children stare. Sturdy's ships took on coal again, because that is what ships do after a fight before they start the next work. The dead remained where the South Atlantic keeps most of its stories, and in time, tracings of hulls were marked on charts so that fishermen and liners would not tear themselves on what they could not see. A sudden counterattack had not changed the war by itself, but it had taken away a set of hands that had been reaching across oceans since August. The raiders were fewer. The wireless air was quieter. The trade routes breathed easier. In logbooks, the day's entries read clean: weather, courses, shots, sinkings, as if it had all been inevitable. On the water, it had been a long day of small tasks done under the knowledge that a wrong one would cost a ship. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.